BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
What the latest safety update from Sarepta for its DMD gene therapy means for the field, plus Amylin continues to grow momentum as the hottest target in obesity, and the new leadership at FDA lay out their vision for the future of the agency. We'll discuss all of this on today's BioCentury This Week. I'm Stephen Hansen, one of the directors of Biopharma Intelligence here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
So a bit of a somber story, fortunately, that we're going to start with here today, as over the weekend, Sarepta Therapeutics announced a second case of acute liver failure that led to the death of a non-ambulatory DMD patient treated with their DMD gene therapy, Elevidys. Lauren, wanted to start with you. Maybe we could start off just by going over what the details are here and kind of what this means for Elevidys and for maybe DMD gene therapy in general.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we heard over the weekend that, as you said, a second non-ambulatory patient with DMD who was being treated in one of Sarepta's trials passed away due to acute liver failure. What we've known since the controversy around this approval is that Elevidys seems to show the best efficacy in clinical trials in the younger patients. We also know that this is delivered as, a weight-based therapy. So older patients who have more advanced disease are getting higher doses. Even above a certain weight threshold, 70 kilograms, it's a higher dose per weight than in smaller patients. And what we also know, and we've seen with multiple gene therapies, is that higher doses lead to higher liver tox. Unfortunately, this is a terrible result. It's not completely unanticipated that this was a possibility. So the information that we have from Sarepta is limited. I've heard that this patient may have been dosed about 3 months ago. So for patients, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what is the window for safety. Am I at risk of having an acute liver event? It's just a very scary time. It also means that they've stopped dosing in these trials of non-ambulatory patients. Non-ambulatory patients are not getting commercial access to this gene therapy at this time.
Lauren, you alluded to this. I think one of the things that makes this especially tragic is that it wasn't unanticipated. You've written about it. I wrote about it at the time of the approval, of the accelerated approval for the non-ambulatory patients. That was entirely unexpected. It was a decision that then CBER Director Peter Marks made over, against the consensus of staff in the division that was reviewing it. And what was even more surprisingly, I think, the patient community itself, I remember speaking with some of the patient leaders from DMD, they were surprised by it and they were concerned by it. They were worried that something like this could happen. Physicians who treat these patients met after the accelerated approval for non-ambulatory patients and, expressed concerns about it. Am I missing something here, or is this really a tragedy that could have been avoided?
I think it could have been avoided. But at the same time, the information that we had when the decision to expand the label was that this gene therapy is inducing some microdystrophin expression, regardless of whether a patient is ambulatory or not. So the 8 patients who we had data for at that time had developed 40% of normal microdystrophin expression. That's something. In younger patients, that had been weakly correlated with functional improvements. There is very little indication from those patients that limited set that there was a benefit, a functional benefit at that time. And I think that's where the controversy is. It's about risk benefit. These patients don't have other options. So I think there's definitely a lot of different opinions on whether or not this should have been approved in the first place. But given the fact that there's very little evidence of benefit at the time, I mean, I don't think you're missing anything. I've spoken with patient advocates today, and I've heard that anecdotally, there are families who say, their non-ambulatory a child who was non-ambulatory at the time of receiving this have benefit, have gained function. So, it's just there are a lot of people on both sides. But when it comes to risk benefits, I think this was a case of, very little benefit for a clear risk. Risks are higher, benefits are lower. We know that.
In the non-ambulatory
In the non-ambulatory versus the younger children who originally had access to the accelerated approval.
So two questions. One is, you think that this is applicable to other gene therapies that are in development for DMD? And two, what does it mean more broadly for the field of gene therapy?
This absolutely is applicable. We recently saw data on a program that is being dosed even higher than the approved 1.33 times 10 to the fourth vector genomes per kilogram of Elevidys. So, we know that there's a potential risk there. The problem with DMD and other musculoskeletal rare diseases, genetic diseases, is that it's really hard to detarget an AAV vector from the liver. There is a lot of work going on to try to do that, to spare the liver from the high doses that are needed. And if you're trying to get to enough of the muscle in the body, high doses are needed. If you're trying to get to muscle in a larger patient, even higher doses are needed. And that means it's more stress on the liver. It's more of an inflammatory insult. And, if you look at the rest of Sarepta's pipeline, we did just see that Sarepta has platform designation for this vector, the AAV vector that is used in Elevidys. It's also used in some earlier stage programs that Sarepta has for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And, we don't know yet if there's something specific about the vector or about the gene that's being delivered. We do know that in general, AAV vectors tend to have this problem. So it's possible that it's an issue that just exists for AAV vectors at this time. That said, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is diagnosed at often a broader age range than Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Some of these patients may be older. It raises questions about what's going to happen in those patients. And I think the stock move of Sarepta today may reflect that. We don't know what that means for safety. But again, I think it does reflect a safety concern that has been known for the entire modality. I doubt that at the current state of the technology, AAV vectors can be dosed for older patients outside of the liver right now. It's just, we just keep seeing things like this.
And you mentioned, for muscular diseases in particular, because you need especially high dosing. So would there be gene therapy applications where that kind of dosing isn't needed, where you don't need as high dosing and you might not have as much of a safety concern?
Right now it's the indications that we've already seen gene therapies going to. It's to the liver because it all goes to the liver. So you can use lower doses if you're trying to induce expression of a gene in the liver. It's localized delivery to the eye, maybe to the CNS, things like that. So that's what we've seen so far. I think there are open questions about some of the other organ systems. It's just we've happened to see a lot of the gene therapies being delivered for muscular diseases, and we know that these are where the high doses are needed.
In addition to pointing out kind of the discrepancy in the way that this was handled by FDA compared to normal approvals and normal reviews, one of the things it seems to me that's important going forward would be to say, how can FDA work with the patient community, the scientific community, the medical community to elucidate these issues and get them out there and get scientific consensus on what a path forward is? I think that a month from now or 2 months from now or 3 months from now, we shouldn't have to be guessing about where the scientific consensus is, where FDA is on this, where regulators around the world are. It seems to me like this is a clear example of something where the whole community should very rapidly get together, sort of like when you have an airplane crash, the investigators go there, they start working on it, they investigate it, and then they have a public process of talking about what they found out about. It seems to me this is an example where that kind of approach should be taken. It should be taken quickly, and it should be done in a serious way and in a way that puts the patients and their families at the center of the decision making.
I absolutely agree. And what we saw a few years ago was that at least the companies doing exactly that. There was, severe cases of muscle weakness that were seen across DMD AAV gene therapy trials. The companies came together, shared data, figured out it was patients who had large deletions in this certain region. They would not have figured that out without coming together. And I feel like with some of these liver tox issues, it's kind of the attitude so far has been, well, we know that this can happen. And if it does prove to be something that happens across, something that's just general to AAV vectors, it doesn't just have to happen. We know that certain conditions, certain co-infections or liver disease to begin with, or other treatments may contribute to this risk. We don't know too many details about it. We know that there may be other ways to improve the immunosuppression, but if this was done in a collective way, in a data sharing way, I think that there's a lot of information to be gained that could get to information faster that would help patients be treated more safely.
Well, thank you both, Lauren and Steve, for your input on this. I'm sure, we'll be following this very closely. I know we're going to be tracking this, so I'm sure this will be something that'll come up later. But at the moment, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal-making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
Welcome back. I'm Steve Usden. We're actually going to switch things up a little bit here because Stephen Hansen actually knows the most about the topic that we're going to be talking about next. So I'm going to ask questions and he's going to talk, and then we'll switch back and he'll be the moderator and I'll talk about something else a little bit later. So Stephen, you've been very enthusiastic about amylin as a target for obesity. What's new? What do you want to talk about there? What have we learned recently?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I don't know if it's the most comfortable thing, switching hats here, but you did a good job. So, I think I've talked about this on the podcast a few times before. Back in March, I think was probably the most recent time when we spent some time on this, when we saw a couple big deals. There was AbbVie did a deal with Gubra, and then Roche licensed petrolinotide from Zealand Pharma for $1.7 billion. Both of those were for amylin programs, early stage amylin programs. The latest thing that we've seen was, last week, Metsera, which was one of the only IPOs that's done well this year, largely a cardiometabolic play. They had phase 1 data for their amylin agonist, MET233, that, at least on first blush, looking at the top line data, I think you could make a reasonable argument that is at least an early front runner for potential best-in-class amylin therapy. So last week, what they reported from this phase 1 study was 8.4% placebo-adjusted weight loss at 5 weeks, which, just to give you a bit of context, when Novo in December announced their phase 3 data for CagriSema, there was also a cagrilintide monotherapy arm that showed 9.5% weight loss at 68 weeks. So nearly matching that weight loss at just 5 weeks was pretty impressive data. Add to that what was a pretty benign safety profile. So they had placebo-like safety at what are going to be the starting doses when they run a titration study. And then Metsera also announced sort of a PK profile that shows a half-life of 19 days, which they argue supports once monthly dosing. So that would also be sort of an innovation on top of what we've typically seen as once weekly dosing. So overall, a pretty impressive profile from Metsera last week. And then over the weekend, we had the release of the ADA abstracts. And I don't know if you'd call it a sort of hold my beer moment or not, but Lilly had data out for their amylin agonist, elorilinotide, in which they showed 11.5% placebo-adjusted weight loss at 12 weeks. Again, much better than we saw from cagrilintide, and arguably maybe on a similar trajectory to what we saw with Metsera. So this is a amylin-biased agonist, once weekly, but they also reported nearly 16 days mean half-life for this program. So you could potentially make an argument that they would have the opportunity to look for once monthly dosing potentially with that. And then on top of that, the GI tolerability, again, which is one of the promises of amylin treatment, was that you would have decent weight loss, but then you'd have a much more tolerable safety profile than what you get with the GLP-1. They showed 10% diarrhea, 8% nausea, and only 4% vomiting. So pretty low numbers relative to what we typically see from other incretin therapies.
So a quick question there. So you talked about this dramatic weight loss, and you also mentioned that it's being dosed weekly, but that it has a PK in 116, 119 days. Could this dramatic weight loss be really a result of the kind of accumulative effect because you're redosing on top of it before it's actually cleared from the system? So you're actually giving people bigger doses than it appears.
It could be. And obviously, if, I think these companies, if they were going to move to a once monthly dosing regimen, you would be increasing the dose. But the main thing that comes with, the main challenge that comes with extending the dosing is, I think what we've learned now about the GI tolerability for these weight loss drugs is that typically the tolerability issues come when you have a trough in the PK. So when you're trying to extend it out, if you then have some troughs there, you could see an increase in those tolerability issues, which is maybe why you're seeing such a benign profile now, because you're keeping the drug levels consistently high. So that would be an issue that they'd have to think about in terms of how high do you want to run the dose if you're going to do once monthly. But I think that's just part of the risk benefit profile I think you have to weigh as you move into later studies.
What's next shoe to drop? What are you looking for next?
Yeah, so other things that are coming out of ADA that I think are going to be very interesting, and ADA next weekend in Chicago, I think it's June 20th to the 23rd is when it officially kicks off. Lilly, it's actually a couple more events from Lilly. So one is their bimagrumab, which is their activin inhibitor. They're going to be presenting phase 2b data in combination with semaglutide. So that will be interesting. That'll be the first sort of like real look at a totally sort of, not only just muscle sparing, but sort of muscle sort of building therapy to see what kind of weight loss you can generate there and what the lean mass versus fat mass loss is for that setting in a much larger patient population. And then also probably within the next couple of months, there's a phase 2 trial of Lilly's amylin agonist, eloralintide, that's going to be reading out, but that's going to be potentially up to 48 weeks. So we should get a much better picture on longer term, what kind of weight loss, what kind of tolerability we can see from this amylin class. Because, as you'll recall, sort of earlier this year, I wrote this pretty big story looking at the amylin therapies and maybe a little cheekily kind of hinting at the idea that amylin might have the potential to replace GLP-1 as sort of a backbone therapy in obesity long term. And, I think just based on the data we've seen lately, I still think that's a possibility. I mean, we'll see.
It does actually look like your story. People should go back and read it because it really was prescient. I think you were ahead of the curve there.
Well, we'll see. I mean, again, a lot of this is fairly early stage data, but I think it'll be interesting as we get more data. If this keeps playing out, I think amylin it's going to remain sort of the hottest target here in the field. But let's transition over, Steve. I'll take that hat back from you, and we can transition over to an interesting article that was published last week, I believe in JAMA, from FDA Commissioner McCary and CBER Director Vinay Prasad. I believe they were writing about kind of laying out their vision for the future of the FDA. You want to give us what your kind of biggest takeaways were from that article?
Yeah, so it was very interesting. So there was that article, and then there was a webinar that they did, a half-hour webinar where they talked about the article. So kind of what I'm saying is based both on the article and on their comments there. And I wrote about it, a lot of people wrote about it, and I kind of felt like I read a different article than what everybody else did because my take on it was quite different. One of the things that I saw looking at the article and hearing what they were saying, I think that the most consequential thing that they talked about is something that nobody else wrote about as far as I can tell, which is they expressed a commitment to, quote, massively streamlining the burden to develop biosimilar compounds, unquote. I think that that's something that is easily achievable. There's a scientific and a regulatory consensus for doing that, and it will have massive impacts. I think that you can get away from the assumption that there's going to be a routine need for efficacy trials for biosimilars. They're not really informative. Some people contend that they're not even ethical, and they're massively expensive. At least half of the cost of developing a biosimilar and half of the timeline for it is taken up with these trials that a lot of people believe in most cases don't provide any valuable information. And I think that's something that they could do. And I think it would have massive knock-on effects because you would see more biosimilars developed. You would see biosimilars developed for products for which it's not economically feasible to create a biosimilar today. And you'd see more competition. So you'd see more competing biosimilars against the same reference products. The other thing you could do, if you're talking about massively streamlining the regulatory burden, is to make biosimilars automatically substitutable, not only for the reference product, but among each other. One of the things people don't really understand now is that technically a biosimilar is biosimilar to the reference product, the original biologic, but it hasn't been tested for being biosimilar with another biosimilar, right? Logically, if one is the case, the other is the case. And in practice, especially what happens in Europe, is that there is substitution among biosimilars for the same reference product. I think that if they make those kind of changes and they do it in a thoughtful way, the FDA could dramatically reduce the cost of developing biosimilars. This would reduce healthcare costs and should then provide more headroom for investment in new therapies. It'll also accelerate the innovation cycle because products that wouldn't have been subject to biosimilar competition will be. And as a result of that, the companies that manufacture them will have incentives to accelerate the development of either improvements, real substantial improvements in those products, or in the development of new products. That was one thing they talked about. Another thing they talked about is the creation of what they describe as a new pathway, or piloting a new pathway where, quote, they're going to ask sponsors to submit much of the arduous paperwork to FDA in advance of their final application, enabling regulators to examine the manufacturing plans, draft labels, and packaging before a clinical trial is complete, end quote. What they mean by clinical trial is the pivotal clinical trial. This isn't really a new idea. It's the idea basically of a rolling submission. In their webinar, FDA Commissioner McCary said, yeah, this is really the idea that has been in place for some time of a rolling submission. But then he said, well, the rolling submission process as it's been used in the past hasn't really been effective. And then he said something which I found actually kind of bizarre. He said, well, it hasn't been effective because FDA officials can't be bothered to actually look at the data when it comes in advance. So they don't pay attention to rolling submissions. They just review everything at the end anyway. I found that really an odd way to frame it. But in any case, he's talking about creating this pilot program for rolling submissions. There's a lot of questions that come out of that, right? So one is, what's going to be the selection criteria for the pilots? Another is, how are they going to think about one of the main problems with rolling submissions? And one of the reasons why FDA has been reluctant to use it. It's been used, and it still is used relatively frequently, but not as frequently as some people would hope for. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that it requires FDA to do a tremendous amount of work, and it doesn't ensure that the product is going to be approvable in the end, because it's contingent on the outcome of the pivotal trial. And as we all know, there are a lot of pivotal trials that don't work out as well as people had anticipated they would. So people at FDA have told me is they feel demoralized when they have to spend a lot of time reviewing the manufacturing and the toxicity and other aspects of a review. And then it comes in and turns out that all that work was for nothing because the pivotal trial doesn't come out positive.
I was just going to ask, Steve, did either of them sort of talk about the efficiency of doing it this way? But then, as you say, we all know what the risk profile is for getting a positive, study done in this sector. Did they discuss at all whether this is an efficient use of FDA resources to set up submissions or do more submissions in this way?
No, they didn't. They didn't talk about that, but they did make it clear that it's a pilot program. So that, again, it really raises the question of what's going to be the threshold, what's going to be the bar for deciding what gets into this pilot program, and are they going to try to prioritize things that they have some reasons for believing that it's more likely than not that the pivotal trial is going to be successful. Having said all these things, I talked to some CEOs about it, and they were excited about it, frankly, and they said, really that from their point of view, wider use of rolling submissions could be a game changer. It could cut months and months off of the review time. Another thing, though, that somebody from FDA pointed out to me that one of the more time-consuming and one of the more contentious aspects of a review is the negotiation or the discussions between FDA and drug sponsors about the label, about the indication. And that can't happen until you know the result of the pivotal trial, because you can't accurately characterize the safety or the efficacy until you know what the data from that trial is. So I think this is something that's going to be, people are going to be watching for. I was at an event just this morning, the DIA conference, where Dr. McCary spoke on a panel. He said that FDA is going to be announcing new pilots very soon. So it isn't clear whether he was talking about this or whether he was talking about the ultra-rare pathway that he's also discussed previously and I've written about and we've talked about on this podcast. Those are possibilities. Another thing that was really interesting to me, and I think to a lot of people, about the JAMA piece and also about the comments that Dr. McCary and Dr. Prasad made on the webinar, was they talked about the Trump administration's most favored nation drug pricing proposals. They talked about the disparities between pricing in the United States and pricing in other OECD countries, which honestly, it's an unusual thing for an FDA commissioner to be talking about. Pricing isn't something that's under the purview of the FDA. Dr. McCary said that, said as much in the JAMA piece, and in the webinar, he said FDA is not involved in drug price policy, and then he went on to reiterate the concerns that the Trump administration has about disparities between pricing in the United States and abroad. And in the webinar, he said, we can ask companies to have more affordable prices for Americans relative to the prices for the same products in OECD countries. He didn't say who the we was. I can't imagine that it was FDA, but he didn't clarify that. And then he followed it by saying things that FDA can do to enhance competition, including of biosimilars, trying to facilitate the approvals of more than one drug or multiple drugs in a class, and things like that. So it was a little bit difficult to interpret exactly what he meant by that. He also repeated criticisms that HHS Secretary Kennedy have made, saying that drug companies spend more money on marketing and promotion than they do on research and development. That's an allegation that PhRMA, the trade association, and many drug companies say is based on flawed interpretation of data and that it isn't true. And again, what I would say is whether it's true or not, it's a little bit difficult to understand how it's relevant to the job that FDA does.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that I sort of jumped out to me was maybe unsurprisingly, but I mean, do you think it's fair to say that this sort of points to, or maybe more than hints at, the politicization of the FDA commissioner? And I mean, because I would think that in prior commissioners, very well may have had personal opinions on these sorts of things, but I don't think they ever would have shared them publicly, right? Especially when they were wearing the commissioner's sort of hat.
It's clear that Commissioner McCary is cut from a different mold from previous commissioners. He's been much more enthusiastic about embracing political issues and advancing the administration's policies on issues that in the past haven't appeared to be related to the FDA. It's notable that the Trump administration, the President Trump's executive order on most favored nation pricing for pharmaceuticals mentioned FDA in a way that some in the industry felt was a kind of veiled threat that the FDA may somehow become involved in enforcing most favored nation pricing policies. And I think that a distinction that's important to be made between the FDA commissioner or any public health agency heads advancing broad public policies that are in alignment with the White House and the way that is interpreted or becomes interpreted by officials who are actually making regulatory decisions. There's no evidence right now that latter is happening. And I think it's a concern that people have, but it hasn't happened. And I would add another concern, which is the kind of high-level directions that Commissioner McCary said that he wants the FDA to go, for example, with an ultra-rare pathway, with the rolling submission pilot, things like that, and how smoothly that's going to be adopted by FDA staff, by the career staff who have to do it, especially given the fact that they're under a lot of stress from the firings and from the kind of terminations of employees. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of transparency about exactly how many people have left or how many people have been rehired. But what I'm hearing from people at FDA is that it's a challenge for them to meet the day-to-day deadlines that they need to. There was an announcement just on Friday of a product that missed a PDUFA deadline, and FDA acknowledged it was because of staffing difficulties. So, I think it's something to keep an eye on.
About a month ago, when I was talking to investors, FDA and their ability to continue to be a gold standard regulator for our sector, that was sort of the number one issue that investors were concerned about. All in, when we consider all these things, the JAMA and everything, kind of where things stand now, does any of this assuage some of those fears that investors have, or do you think there's still legitimate reason for them to be concerned?
Both. I think that when it comes to rare diseases, especially ultra rare diseases, when it comes to the intentions of Commissioner McCary, I think that there are reasons. And for example, what I talked about biosimilars, those are things that are definitely have the potential to be very positive. But there's also an underlying concern, both about a lack of competence and capacity as a result of all of the turnover, basically the brain drain at FDA. And I think also an ongoing concern that hasn't been completely laid to rest about political considerations impacting regulatory decisions. We've obviously seen that already in vaccines, and I think we're going to see it more in vaccines. I think part of that we're going to see is a blurring in the distinction between vaccine labeling decisions and the kind of recommendations that the ACIP makes about usage of vaccines. Commissioner McCary frequently talks about his idea that certain kinds of drugs, especially for children, are overprescribed. At the event this morning, he talked about treatments for ADHD and in his view that they're massively overprescribed. And so you have to think, well, is that going to lead to regulatory decisions regarding those kinds of drugs? If the FDA commissioner is talking about it, you have to think that that is at least a possibility. There are other areas where political or ideological motivations may alter FDA regulatory policy. HHS Secretary Kennedy has expressed the viewpoint that stem cell therapies that don't have solid scientific evidence, that the scientific community doesn't believe have been demonstrated to be safe and effective, and that haven't been subject to rigorous safety and efficacy trials. Secretary Kennedy has said that he believes that those should be more widely available and the FDA shouldn't be regulating them. He's expressed similar ideas about what he calls alternative medicine and about psychedelic drugs. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen in all those areas. It's hard to remember it, but we're really just in the early days of the Trump administration and of Marty McCary being the FDA commissioner. But those are all areas, I think, where there's likely to be some kind of movement. And finally, I mentioned one other, of course, which is the regulation of mifepristone, the abortion drug. FDA has launched some kind of an investigation of the safety issues around the regulation of mifepristone. It remains to be seen where that's going to go.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Steve. A very complete and nuanced answer as ever. Wouldn't expect anything less from you. So thank you very much. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment or a review. You can find all of these stories at biocenturypodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.